In Chapter 12, we'll look at plants and fungus and how they changed throughout evolutionary time. We'll start with plants, and so we need a basic working definition of what is a plant. So plants are all multicellular. Plants are all also eukaryotic, so they have a nucleus and other membrane-bound structures internally. Plants are photosynthetic, so they use light to produce energy. They're a type of autotroph. Or some plants are parasitic, so they rely on others to get their food source. Also, a defining characteristic of plants is that they have a protected embryo. Plants face several challenges because they're rooted to one spot and they don't move around, so they have to be able to obtain food, and they also have to reproduce and avoid predation. And we'll look at all of these as we go through the chapter and kind of how plants have managed to meet these challenges and survive. Looking about 475 million years ago, when the first plants started adapting to land, they came from green algae. So the ancestors of plants were green algae, so photosynthetic aquatic organisms. And as they started moving on to land, they developed means to support their bodies. So if you're in water, you don't need a tough exterior cell wall because the water supports the body. However, as that green algae started being exposed more and more to the land and moving up onto the land, it developed a stronger cell wall to support the body cells as it moved on to land. Also, if you're no longer surrounded by water, losing water and desiccating or drying out is a big problem. So they developed a cuticle or started secreting a waxy substance externally that would then coat the surface and prevent them from drying out. And you can still see the cuticle on many plants today. If you look at some plants, they look almost waxy, and at first you may think, well, it's a fake plant, but if you get close and look at it, you realize it's actually a real plant. Well, that waxy layer is the cuticle. It's a substance produced by the plants and excreted outside of the cells so that it coats the leaves and protects it from drying out. Once plants had moved on to land, they continued to develop and progress additional features, and we'll go through these, but we start with non-vascular plant. Vascular just means that they have a circulatory system, a way to purposefully transport things like water and nutrients around their body. So we'll look at non-vascular plants. Then they develop specialized structures to transport water and nutrients. So vascular plants, we'll look at those. The development of seeds was important, and also finally of flowers. That was the most recent development in plants. And we'll look at all these from an ancestral algae all the way through angiosperms or flowering plants. So looking at this figure again, we'll start at the top. Does the plant have vessels or a vascular system to transport water and nutrients? The plants that don't are non-vascular, and there are about 20,000 species of those. And they are bryophytes or mosses, kind of an interchangeable term there. So bryophytes have no vascular tissue. To get water and nutrients to all parts of their body, they use diffusion. So the water, maybe from rain, just has to be absorbed into the plant and diffused through it. Sort of like if you set a sponge on top of a puddle of water, it's going to diffuse or slowly move through the sponge until it reaches the top. So same concept in mosses, that water has to diffuse throughout the plant. Same thing with nutrients that are produced. They have to diffuse, so the sugars have to diffuse to get to all the cells of the plant. Mosses have an alternating life cycle. They have a haploid adult and a diploid kind of embryo stage, and they produce haploid spores. So if we start over here at kind of a recognizable moss, that's going to be haploid. This is kind of different from what we normally think, because in humans, the haploid would just be the gametes, reproductive cells, so sperm and egg, and the diploid would be the adults. This is kind of reversed from what we normally think of, but the haploid adult stage will produce sperm and egg, and in mosses, they have separate male and female stalks. So one stalk will produce the sperm, the other will produce an egg, and reproduction, really what needs to happen is a drop of water needs to hit the sperm producing stalk and splash the sperm over onto an egg producing stalk. This is why mosses only survive in very moist areas that have condensation and water that would allow transfer of sperm. Also, because they don't have any vascular tissue, they need that water available so they can absorb it into their body and use diffusion to get it around. Once they've been successfully fertilized, then we have the diploid stage, and it develops into an embryo, and that embryo then will produce spores, and the spores are produced using meiosis. So this is where it does reduction division to make spores. So now we have these haploid spores. Those spores, wherever they land, if it's a favorable environment, they're going to grow into an adult moss. So in this adult, if we're back to the adult stage, these just produce sperm and egg. They don't need to go through meiosis to make sperm and egg, because sperm and egg are already haploid, because meiosis was used to produce those spores. For the members of the bryophyte group, or mosses, they're mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And all of these are actually found in Iowa, so if you go out walking through the woods, you might find samples of all of these, including the liverworts and hornworts. A little bit more about mosses, their importance. They have lots of economic importance because they cover the soil and they form fairly tight mats. They help to hold the soil in place and prevent erosion. Once you start losing the moss, the soil can erode, and we can see that this tree is basically suspended out over the cliff, just barely holding on with its roots. And the reason this landscape looks like this is it's lost the moss covering, and so over time, weathering has eroded all the soil right out from underneath the tree. So that would be environmental impacts. Economic impacts. So moss has a variety of applications economically. Actually, there's a lot of moss additives in different ingredients and foods and cosmetics and other things as thickening agents and whatnot, to give it textures. Also, things like peat moss can be used directly. So peat moss is cut right out of the ground and into bricks, and it's used for a variety of things, mostly for fire over in Scotland. So moss has an incredible environmental and economic impact. So looking still if the plant has vesicles or vessels to transport water nutrients, the ones that do, starting right here, so our bryophytes are the only group that doesn't, we'll look at our vascular seedless plants, and they were the next to branch off. And our vascular seedless plants, again, that vascular system is formed of hollow tubes to transport water or nutrients. Those hollow tubes are called xylem and phloem, but in this class we're just going to focus on those hollow tubes and not their specific names. And that first group includes ferns and horsetails. They have a vascular system, but they're still using spores, very much like the moss. Those spores are housed inside little capsules called sporangia. So this is a close-up of the bottom side of a fern leaf, and all these little sporangia capsules contain hundreds of thousands of spores, and when they're developed, those capsules will burst open, releasing the spores. When those spores land, they're going to grow into a very small, kind of almost heart-shaped leaf structure, and this haploid version of the fern, very much like we saw with our mosses, is going to produce the eggs and sperm. So the life cycle over here, we have our sporangia on the underside of the leaf producing spores. They're released. When they land in a favorable environment, they produce this haploid fern that's rooted. At one end of it, they're going to produce eggs. The other end, they'll produce sperm. Now these will rely on, again, drops of water to splash from one to the next, or if the surface of the leaf is wet, sometimes the sperm can swim and can self-fertilize, but other times it requires sperm from a different plant. Once we have fertilization occur, that embryo starts to grow, in the diploid and forms the fern that we would recognize. So this large fern, when it is, I guess, sufficiently developed, it can form spores again on the underside. So if you ever see a fern with kind of little rust-colored spots on the underside of the leaf, it is, I guess, a healthy fern, and it's ready to reproduce. I had a student years ago, when we did this lecture, she's like, oh, well, I'll stop throwing away my ferns, because every time she got a fern, after she'd had it for a while, it would form these little rust spots, and she was worried it was a disease or it was sick, so she'd throw away her fern and go buy a new one. So if you get those on the underside, give it some additional soil and maybe grow some little haploid ferns. Looking at the production of seeds, so ferns, again, they're vascular, but they don't have seeds. The production of seeds are two groups that use seeds. They're the gymnosperms and angiosperms. We want to look at the importance of seeds, why that was such a major development for plants. First of all, seeds contain the embryo, so the offspring. And in addition to the embryo, the seed contains water, nutrients, and a protective coating. So now it gives that embryo an advantage. It's protected and it has food and water readily available. So unlike spores, which are single cell, the seed is multicellular and can be preserved for a longer period of time. So spores have to land fairly quickly in a favorable environment or else they dry out. Seeds can last much longer before finding a favorable location to grow. The endosperm layer inside the seeds, and that's the majority of the internal layer of the seed, so all of this is endosperm. So that endosperm layer, that contains carbohydrates. Usually when we eat seeds, it's that endosperm that we're after, that carbohydrate layer that was put in there as a nutrition source for the embryo. Gymnosperms and angiosperms both have that endosperm layer, which is reflected in their name. Gymnosperm literally means naked seed, so it's not covered or coated by anything, and we'll see that when we look at gymnosperms in more detail. The life cycle, they still have a haploid stage. However, that haploid stage now is supported fully within the adult in things called gametophytes. So the gametophytes for the male plants are pollen, and the gametophyte for females are the ovules. So now that haploid stage is carried internally, very much like animals. They have that haploid stage that's carried internally. And seeds aid in dispersal because they can last much longer than the spores could.